all my life, I always just assumed that Watson's was SM's response to Mercury Drug. But apparently, Watson's is so much bigger than that. They're owned by A.S. Watson, the world's largest health and beauty retailer. They have 16,800 stores globally as of 2024, and it's a lot of stores. And A.S. Watson is owned by the wealthiest person in Hong Kong, Li Ka-Shing. Watson started out in Hong Kong in the late 1800s, and if you've been to Hong Kong, you'll see that A.S. Watson has its hands in so many industries. They even own one of the largest bottled water companies in Hong Kong. Watson's opened store number 8,000 in 2024, and they're closing in on Mercury Drug fast. In this video, I'll take you to a couple of Watson's locations here in Iloilo City while telling you about the brand origin story of Watson's, strategies they used that made them super successful, and how they plan on conquering the Philippines and the rest of the world in the future. My name is Chris, welcome to Brand Origins. Now, if you're like me, the only thing you know about Watson's is that it's SM's revenge against Mercury Drug. So there's this age-old tale that people keep retelling. Now, we can't prove this, but they say that back in the early days of SM, when SM's founder Henry C. himself was still selling shoes from a cart, he asked Mercury Drug if he could set up shop in front of their store. Mercury Drug was already ahead, and they were getting a lot of foot traffic, and so he asked them, but they shooed him away and they rejected him. And the story goes that in this moment, this was when Henry C. vowed, saying that someday when I get rich, you're not getting anything from me. And they say that that's the reason why there are no Mercury Drug branches in any of the many 95 plus malls of SM around the country. And so instead of having Mercury Drug inside of their malls, SM opened their own. So that's why they have Watson's. But then Henry C.'s daughter, Tessie C. Cawson, has already explicitly denied this. She said that the families behind SM and Mercury Drug were all okay with each other. She was like, hey, there's no drama. We're all friends here. We just couldn't agree with the rental rates. Believe it or not, I'm not sure. It just doesn't make sense to me personally because SM would always bring in the top brands. Why would they suddenly not go for the most recognized and most trusted drugstore brand in the country? And this whole tale is the reason why I thought that SM launched Watson's. Like, I really thought that they just did this to have a Mercury Drug alternative within SM. And I was so wrong because first of all, SM didn't even launch Watson's. Watson's has been around way before SM and Mercury Drug. And it's a completely different monster, having a presence all over the world and owning so many brands under its name. So what exactly is the story of Watson's? Now, I know this isn't a channel about wars and conflict, but it's impossible to talk about the history of Watson's without talking about the Opium Wars and how Hong Kong ended up in British hands. Because it will give us some context as to why they were doing whatever they were doing at that time. This is opium. Opium was grown in China since the 11th century. But it was only around the 17th century when they started getting hooked on it, because that was when they discovered that when you burn opium, you get a feeling of euphoria that's on a whole new level. Basically, you get high. And so people in China were loving opium. But then the Chinese government was like, uh-oh, opium's good, but I think it's getting too good. Because our people are getting addicted to this and they're pretty much just taking opium and that's all they're doing the entire day. There actually came a point when the productivity of China's workforce came crashing down because of opium. Because they'd use it, enjoy it, and they were hooked. It became such a problem that they decided to ban opium in China. And they were very serious about this. In fact, there were 2 emperors who decided to ban opium in China. Now, during this period, China was kind of an isolationist country. Like, they were fine on their own. But of course, they were still involved in trading with other countries. And this is where Britain comes in. So you know how the British love tea? They love their tea. And at that time, China was producing really good tea. And so Britain was getting a lot of their tea from China. Like, a lot of tea. Now, normally, when 2 nations would trade, this is just an example, Britain could trade finished goods like textiles or iron, and in exchange, China trades their tea. The problem was China didn't need anything from Britain, or at least not as much as Britain needed tea from China. So Britain would offer China goods that they would want to trade tea for. But then China was like, yeah, we don't really need that. We're doing okay over here. You could just trade your silver for our tea. And so Britain went for it. They didn't really have a choice. They love their tea. And so Britain was importing these large amounts of tea from China. And since they didn't have a choice to trade their silver for China's tea, this was gradually depleting their silver reserves. And so Britain was like, okay, this is unsustainable. There has to be a better way. And they figured, all right, China doesn't want any of the goods that we offer them. Maybe we could just figure out what they want and and we could trade them for it. And that's when he remembered how much the Chinese loved opium so much that their government had to ban it. But Britain couldn't produce opium because the plant where opium comes from, it can only be grown in specific warmer climates. And they were like, oh wait, why don't we just grow them in one of our colonies? And that colony would happen to be India. And so Britain would start smuggling opium from India to China. But remember, opium was banned in China. And so instead of trading directly with the government, they would trade them to independent Chinese merchants. China soon noticed, hey, I think our people are getting high all day again. Didn't we just ban opium? That's when they found out that the British were smuggling opium into China. And one day, they stumbled across this massive supply of opium. Around 20 large crates of opium. There was so much opium that was meant to be sold to the Chinese. And not taking this lightly, China responded. And so what they did was they burned all this opium. They burned all the opium they could find, and they did this publicly to send a message to Britain. If you want to go keep smuggling opium, we'll just keep burning it. But what this response did, instead of putting all of this to an end, it ended up escalating the whole thing. Because this is what triggered the start of the First Opium War in 1839. This would end up being a one-sided affair because Britain and the Royal Navy were just far too powerful and far too dominant. So after a series of battles that ended relatively quickly, by 1841, they were able to occupy Hong Kong. And the following year, the war ended with the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking is known as one of the first unequal treaties in history. This treaty gave the island of Hong Kong to Britain. This forced China to allow Britain to freely trade with any merchants in China, even though it would ruin the lives of millions of the Chinese people due to addiction, and forced China to pay damages for the opium they destroyed. This essentially ensured that Britain could continue smuggling opium into China via Hong Kong. Now, around this time, Westerners started arriving, and two of these were Peter Young and Dr. Alexander Anders. They launched the Hong Kong Dispensary. Dispensaries are basically kind of like pharmacies. In 1845, this is when Dr. Thomas Boswell Watson, who is a Scottish doctor, arrived in Asia and set up his practice in Macau. He eventually moved to Hong Kong in 1856, and that's when he became a part owner of the Hong Kong Dispensary. But sadly, around this time, his health deteriorated. And so he invited his 22-year-old nephew to come to Hong Kong to take over his place. His name was Dr. Alexander Skirving Watson. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself, but if you don't know, the parent company of Watson's is A.S. Watson. And A.S. Watson was named after this guy, Alexander Skirving Watson. He was one of the reasons why Watson's grew so fast because he found a way to increase the supply of medicine to the Navy. He was a great leader, and it was because of his leadership that they were able to turn this small dispensary into a fully fledged retail chemist operation. I needed to talk about the Opium War so that you get a clear picture as to how important opium was during that time. I mean, wars are being fought over it. Knowing how important it is, imagine being one of the few chemists authorized to sell opium. And that's the advantage that A.S. Watson had. They were one of the few who were allowed to sell it, and this gave them a huge advantage over the competition. Now, in the middle of all this, the Second Opium War happened. This was from 1856 to 1860. I'm not gonna get into the details of all that, but long story short, Britain was just way too strong for China. And so China lost. And when it ended, Britain pretty much made sure that imports of opium into China were now free-flowing. Since China couldn't do anything about it because of their vastly inferior navy, they had no choice but to just legalize opium. Even though they knew that an entire generation of their people were going to get addicted to opium, they had no choice. This was a fascinating discovery, but a bit of a sad one. I went down the rabbit hole of the opium wars and what opium could do to you, and apparently, opium withdrawal could actually kill you. Like, there are so many stories of people from Hong Kong who have had relatives, grandparents who have died due to opium withdrawal. So yeah, because of this, imports of opium tripled, which also meant that A.S. Watson sales were through the roof. They were already doing well, but when this happened, they were pretty much unstoppable. Sadly, during this period of extreme growth, Alexander Skirving Watson had to go back to England, where he would pass away at the age of 28. While writing the script, it shocked me how young he was when he accomplished all this. Like, wait, the story with Watson started when he was 22? And he did all that by the age of 28 in 6 years? That's amazing. Now, by 1895, A.S. Watson had over 35 stores. What's interesting is that A.S. Watson was actually already slowly diversifying into other industries at this point. They weren't only selling medicine anymore, they were producing over 300 dispensary, toiletry, perfumery lines, all kinds of stuff. Despite the rise in popularity of opium during that time, people in Europe started seeing the disastrous effects of opium. It started getting a bad rap, and so A.S. Watson, the company, started shifting towards opium substitutes. When it was no longer profitable for Britain to trade opium and when it started being regulated, opium substitutes rose in popularity. And so once again, A.S. Watson was able to take advantage. They were able to ride the popularity of these new products. By 1901, they've now grown to over 100 locations, and they even had branches in China and the Philippines. In 1903, they saw an opportunity in selling water because around that time, the quality of water in Hong Kong was just really bad. So in 1903, they established Watson's Water. Watson's Water isn't here in the Philippines, but they actually have a huge presence in a couple of countries in Asia. Now at this point, A.S. Watson was already this big company with a regional presence. But they got even bigger, eventually landing in the hands of Hong Kong's wealthiest man, Li Ka-Shing. So how did this happen? Now there's a couple of companies involved here, but it all starts with Hutchison International, a company that imported large amounts of consumer products founded in 1877. There was a time when the Hutchison Group went on a shopping spree acquiring a handful of companies, which in 1963 included a partial acquisition of A.S. Watson. And all these acquisitions formed the Hutchison Group. 2 years later, the Hutchison Group went on and acquired a company called Hong Kong and Whampoa Dock. It's a port management company operating what once was one of the largest dockyards in Asia. And the new group, as a result of this acquisition, became Hutchison Whampoa. Now, unfortunately, things took a turn in 1975. Leaders of the company made these very risky financial bets on the stock market and on foreign currency, hoping for a profitable return, but these backfired and caused major financial losses. It was so bad that the company needed to be bailed out. HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, refused to bail out Hutchison Whampoa and instead acquired a 22% stake in the company. The following year, the company was listed on the stock exchange. In 1979, Li Ka-Shing ended up acquiring HSBC's 22% stake via his holding company, Cheong Kong Holdings. 2 years later, in 1981, the now Li Ka-Shing partially owned Hutchison Whampoa took full control of A.S. Watson. Now at this point, A.S. Watson now had that financial war just to expand operations. And oh man, did they expand, because A.S. Watson went shopping. In the 1980s, A.S. Watson grew rapidly. They entered Taiwan, Macau, Singapore, and China all under the name Watson's the Chemist, which was the name of their retail stores that time until they rebranded to the present-day Watson's we all know today. Now, while Watson's was expanding in Asia, growing its own brand, A.S. Watson, the parent company, embraced a market entry acquisition strategy. That's when, instead of growing their own brand, the company simply decides to acquire an existing brand in order to quickly gain entry into a new market. So this is what they did when they wanted to, let's say, enter a new country. And that's because these existing brands, they already have their own customer base, distribution networks, and building all that from scratch, even though they're capable, it'll just take so much time and so much resources. And it was simply cheaper to just cash out and acquire these brands because at this point, money wasn't really a problem for A.S. Watson anymore. They started in Hong Kong when they acquired Fortress. Interestingly, A.S. Watson acquired a Hong Kong-based juice brand called Mr. Juicy. In the early 2000s, A.S. Watson wanted to enter the UK and Europe, and so they acquired Savers Health and Beauty. And they also did this with the Netherlands-based, I'm probably gonna ruin this, okay? Kruidvat Group, which owned brands such as Superdrug, the second largest health and beauty retailer in the UK, Rossmann, a health and beauty brand in Germany which had 4,700 stores. And this was a 7 billion euro acquisition since the group had a store portfolio of around 1,900 outlets. In 2004, Li Ka-Shing increased his stake in Hutchison Whampoa from 22% to 49.9%. And then the acquisitions continued because in the same year, A.S. Watson acquired Drogas, the leading health and beauty chain in the Baltics, which includes Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. In 2005, they acquired The Perfume Shop, the UK's leading fragrance retailer. And in this same year, they entered Turkey by acquiring Cosmo Shop. And when they wanted to enter Russia, they simply acquired Spectre. In 2006, they entered Ukraine by acquiring DC, the only nationwide health and beauty retail chain in the Ukraine. Now, there were several other acquisitions, but at this point, I'm sure now you know just how big A.S. Watson is. So how about the Philippines? Well, in 2002, the SM Group and A.S. Watson formed a joint venture to bring Watsons to the Philippines. Even though Mercury Drug, which opened in 1945, had a 57-year head start, Watsons has grown rapidly in the country. Now, part of their growth is due to their new store formats. Now, I remember a time when you could only find Watsons inside SM malls, but recently you could now find Watsons in these independent locations outside of SM. In this case, there's a Watsons here in Oton, in Iloilo, here in this Pure Gold branch. So these smaller Watsons locations are what they call their community stores. In 2004, Watsons celebrated the opening of its 8,000th store in Asia and ended the year with a store count of 1,166 in the Philippines. But perhaps what fascinated me the most was this new thing that Watsons was rolling out. Now, before we talk about this, you have to understand that A.S. Watson isn't just this massive retail company. It's a data empire. They have so much data on their hands and they found a way to monetize it. With 16,500 stores in 28 markets worldwide, 8,000 of which are Watsons, A.S. Watson serves an unbelievable 5.3 billion customers per year. That's around 14.5 million people per day. Now, these numbers alone should paint a picture of how big A.S. Watson is, and most importantly, the incredible amount of data they have about their customers. But here's where it gets really interesting. 137 million people use the Watsons loyalty card, and this card tracks purchases, preferences, shopping habits. And so when you have that much data about this many people, which extends or covers several years, you get to see trends because you know what people are buying, how often they buy it, what they bought in the past, and what they're likely to buy next. They don't even need you to get a physical card anymore. There's an electronic version. And it's free because this data is very important to them. So they just need you to get into their system as seamless as possible. So how does this work? Let's take facial wash as an example. Let's say you've been buying this particular brand of facial wash from Watson since January up until May. And so Watson sees this in your transaction history in your rewards card. Now, the data shows that you didn't stop buying facial wash. You simply stopped buying that particular brand of facial wash in May. Because in June, they see it, that you bought another brand of facial wash. And so because of this data, brands can now investigate accurately and get insights. So then they could study this particular customer. They could be like, why did Chris switch to another brand in June? Before June, did that other facial wash brand lower their prices? Was it possible that before June, they launched a new marketing campaign? Or did they launch a new product which triggered Chris to switch? Maybe that product was superior? Or maybe it's our fault. Did we run a marketing campaign? Did we use a new tagline and maybe Chris no longer responds to that, which made him switch in June? And so these are the insights that they can get from the data Watsons has. And so for brands, this is very valuable. And not only that, brands also get insights as to what other products their customers are buying. So they can like see parallels. They get to see like, for example, 70% of women from ages 20 to 25, every time they buy their Colgate, they also buy that facial wash. This might push them to propose a partnership with that particular brand of facial wash. And that's why in the supermarket, I don't know if you guys have noticed, sometimes you'll see brands partnering up, like they'll have this bundle like tuna and Skyflakes. I don't know. Sometimes you see it, it looks weird, but there's a reason why they did that bundle. It means there's enough data that supports that. Now you understand how valuable this data is, especially for those big brands. And Watsons has monetized this with Optimo. It's their new data analytics platform. And so brands pay to get access to this data that helps them understand their customers better and helps them make better decisions. And it is so smart because this is data that Watsons and all the other brands under A.S. Watson, they accumulate all this data for free simply by running their stores. So yeah, this just gets more valuable the bigger Watson grows. And they continue to grow. Watsons is constantly building and trying to cement its place as the leader in the health and beauty space. And it's making sure that it appeals to younger Gen Z and the growing Gen Alpha audience. In China, they introduced Watsons Pink. It's a pink Watsons, but that's not all that it is though. So Watson's Pink locations have spa services inside them, and they're all about giving customers the opportunity to do self-care while browsing their favorite products. It was designed primarily for the younger demographic, and they're hoping that their customers appreciate it beyond just the pink aesthetics. So yeah, Watson's isn't showing signs of stopping. In 2023, they underwent a major rebrand, and AS Watson announced an additional investment of $250 million to upgrade 6,000 of its stores in key markets in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So even though our initial tendency is to compare Mercury Drug with Watson's since they have like a pharmacy now, Watson's is in a completely different category. And only time will tell if anyone can even get in their way soon. So yeah, that's about it. Now you know about the brand origin story of Watson's. Thanks for joining me in this episode of Brand Origins. It would help me a lot if you could click the like button and maybe comment down below what you learned from this episode. It's the only way for the algorithm to push my videos to more people like you. And follow me on Instagram and TikTok. I have shorter clips there. My name is Chris. I'll see you in the next episode.